Cell membranes are a very busy place with raw materials entering the cell and wastes exiting the cell in a continuous flow of traffic across the membrane. Cell membranes can regulate this flow of traffic by being choosy about the substances that they let into and out of the cell, and this is referred to as selective permeability. So cell membranes are selectively permeable. Permeable means substances can pass through the membrane. So being selectively permeable means that the cell membrane is particular or choosy about which substances can transport into or out of cells. And this is the case with cell membranes where some substances can actually pass freely through the bilayer, but others, such as sugar from digested energy bars, require help from proteins. This diagram illustrates selective permeability. Imagine you had some sort of a container like this that you could put a membrane or some sort of plastic barrier in the middle of the container, and that particular membrane had holes in it that allowed some substances through and other substances not to pass through that membrane. This means that that membrane would be selectively permeable. And another term for this, which is interchangeable with selective permeability, is differentially permeable. So this is a differentially permeable membrane. Now if you filled that container up with water on both sides of that membrane, so here are the water molecules represented by blue dots, but then on only one side, this right side, you added some sucrose molecules. And what this diagram is trying to illustrate is that you can see that there is a flow of water molecules from the left side to the right side of the container through the membrane, and water molecules are also moving from the right side to the left side of the container through the membrane. So it is permeable, this membrane is permeable to the water molecules. However, the sucrose molecules, represented by these green shapes, are too large to move through the holes in the membrane, so they can't go from the right side of the container to the left side of the container. This means they're impermeable. The membrane is impermeable to the sucrose molecules. In other words, they can't pass through that membrane. So because of this property, the membrane is selective about which molecules can and cannot pass through or permeate through that membrane. When referring to the transport of substances through a cell membrane, you have to get used to the terms solute, solvent, and solution. So a solvent is a liquid that dissolves a solid, liquid, or a gas. A solute is a substance that dissolves into a solvent, and a solute and a solvent make a solution together. So an example is sugar, which is a solute, and you can add sugar, your solute, to water, which is your solvent, because it is a liquid in which you're dissolving your sugar. When you dissolve the sugar into the water, you end up with a solution, a sugary solution. In the case of cells, the solute could be molecules such as hormones, oxygen, carbon dioxide, or active ingredients in pharmaceutical drugs. And of course, your solvent is the water that you have inside your cytoplasm or outside of the cell. So solutes, such as hormones, oxygen, carbon dioxide, etc., are dissolved in the watery solution inside the cytoplasm and outside the cytoplasm, and because of this, they can actually transport through the cell membrane. Because cell membranes have the ability to be selective about which substances can transport or permeate across the membrane, the interior of a cell is chemically different from the outside of the cell. Concentrations of some solutes are higher inside the cell than outside, and others are lower. Likewise, the inside of each organelle in a eukaryotic cell may be chemically quite different from the rest of the cell. Because you can have varying concentrations of solutes inside and outside of the cell, it establishes something called a concentration gradient. A gradient is simply a difference between two areas that are close together, and in cells this gradient occurs because of a difference in the concentration of solutes on either side of the cell membrane. So this is an example of a cell membrane, a lipid bilayer, and on one side of the cell, let's just say it was the outside of the cell or the extracellular space, has a higher concentration of these red spheres which represent a solute than on the inside of the cell or inside the cytoplasm. So you have a higher concentration on the outside of the cell of these solutes than you do inside the cytoplasm, and this establishes something called a concentration gradient. All forms of transport across membranes involve gradients. The movement of substances across cell membranes may or may not require energy, and you're going to be learning about two different categories of transport across membranes. These are passive transport and active transport. So the transport or the movement of substances across a cell membrane that does not require energy is referred to as passive transport. And transport that does require energy is referred to as active transport. And we're going to be looking at these two specific types of transport in more detail.